good to see everybody back here for another time that we've been instructed to is it on? To worship God in spirit and in truth. That's what God seeks for us to do, to put Him first in our lives, to come together on that first day of the week and to do what we've been doing, do what we do every Sunday. It's great to see our sister Betty back with us. We got Jan back a couple of weeks ago, and to have Betty back, and I know Jesse's still not here, so we're praying for our sister Jessie, and we're praying for others in the kingdom. We're getting people back from being sick also. We know there's a lot of sickness going on out there, so continue to pray for one another. Continue to pray for Tracy and also Angie and their MRIs that are coming up, that everything goes well, and we trust that they will. But no matter what, we know that God is always there for us, for His children. I want you to imagine being invited to a great feast. This is a distinguished dinner. The table has been set, the atmosphere has been prepared. But when the meal begins, guests are focused on everything but the reason why they come together. Some are overindulging. Others are not paying attention. They're ignoring those who are in need. Most importantly, the host is completely disregarded. How awkward would that feel for you if you came together for the right reasons and had that going on? See, in life, there are moments when we need to stop and we need to ask ourselves, why am I doing what I am doing? The question matters in our day-to-day activities, but more importantly, that matters most in our spiritual practices. Why do we do this every Sunday? Why do we come together every Lord's Day? You know, when Jesus met the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well in John chapter 4, she said to him, I perceive you as a prophet. She said, our fathers worshipped on the mountain. But she says, you people say that men need to worship God in Jerusalem. Well, Jesus then states this to her, woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people seek the Father, or our Father seeks those worshipers. And then he says in verse 24, God is a spirit, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and in truth. The very fact that God seeks true worshipers means there are those who falsely worship God. There are those who do not worship God in spirit and in truth. So we must make sure, we must not just listen to the preacher or the teacher that preaching the Bible. We need to make sure that we go and we study those scriptures to make sure that we are walking right with God and we are worshiping Him in the way He wants us to worship Him. We started a sermon series last week on true worship, and we looked at Matthew chapter 6, and we looked at how Jesus prayed. We know He prayed every day, and then He taught His disciples in that model prayer on how to pray. And today we're going to look at the Lord's Supper. We're going to start with the part one of the Lord's Supper, one of those sacred practices that we do every Lord's Day, and we do not do it as a routine. We got to think about that. We can't be like going through the motions, right? We need to understand its true purpose. And we hear a good, when the men gather around the table here, and we hear, like Charles said this morning, and whoever's going to be on the Lord's table next week, and we hear what it's about, right? Most of us know what it's about. But today we're going to first look at the first, we always go to 1 Corinthians 11, 23 through 27, That's what we're supposed to do. But always read back. Always go back and look at what the writer's talking about in the context. So today we're going to look at the Lord's Supper and how back then in the first century among the brethren it was distorted. You may already know that, you may not know that. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we're going to be reading 17 through 22. Well, right now 19, but we'll go into 22. Let's read. But in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, because you come together not for the matter or for the better, but for the worse. Verse 18. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, so that those who are approved may become evident among you. Yeah, Paul had praised the church at Corinth before, but on this issue, he's saying he does not praise them. He actually is rebuking them. Look at that word but there. That word but there is a conjunction. It's showing a contrast or an opposition. When we look into the Greek text of this, it's basically stating, here comes the charge. What is that charge? They come together not for the better, but for the worse. We think about, we come together right now as a church assembly, the ecclesia, the called out body of Christ. And we do so for the good, to edify, to store up love and good works. But most importantly, we do so to worship God, don't we? To give him the praise, the glory, and the honor. God calls us to come together in unity. The Lord's Supper is a divine institution by God for his people to come together to share. And they're sharing that word koinonia, that fellowship. And we share in the unity and what we're thinking about when we come together for the Lord's Supper. But here, there was not unity going on here, was there? There was division going on. The fellowship was divided. Kind of like what I said on Wednesday night about this partition here. You have a body here and you have a body in the other in the fellowship hall, and we're doing different things, and we're supposed to be one body coming together. Like if I was to say, let's open this up, and I want you guys over there, do your own thing, and I want us over here, we're going to do our own thing. That's a division, isn't it? They were dividing, but they weren't just meeting. It gets worse. These divisions here in verse 19 and the factions were very problematic. You could also call them sects, or you could call them schisms. Your Bible may talk about schisms, like in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 10. It was just about their own greed and their own self-willed opinions and why they did this. Paul wrote about that, their divisions there in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 10 through 7. He stated that there should be no divisions among you. But that approach, when we go back to chapter 1, it's more of a theological approach. When we look at the approach here, it's more practical. It's dealing with a problem of a division as it shows itself as these Christians came together at the church at Corinth, and they gathered together as a body. So they did come together. That's what one good thing they did. But there is problems, there's divisions. Brethren, there's divisions in our church today, in the Lord's church today. When you look out there all over the place, there's divisions, and it's sad. We have been accused by brethren, not here, but not too far from here. We have been accused by brethren that we are worshiping falsely, that we are on our way to hell. I did not hear that with my own ears, but somebody who knows, actually few people have told me that. But I already knew this goes on. I already knew that there's what is being called the antis, right? Those who do not believe. And the reason why is because they don't believe that we should have a kitchen in the building. There's a big problem with that. There's not a problem if they don't want to have one where they worship. But there's a problem when they address us in a way that we are a cult or we are in sin. Yes, and I'm bringing this to your attention. If you don't know, you need to know. You do need to know. We're going to be talking more about the cup next week when we get into the body and the blood of Christ, the cup, the bread and the cup, the fruit of the vine. So according to these who tell us this, when we're looking at this church in the first century, what were they doing? They were truly defying what Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 11. We eat in the building and we are not sinning. But notice what they were doing in the first century. Let's get into this text a little further. Keep it in context. We always, when we study the Bible, when we look at the Bible, we always have to look at the context of what the scriptures are teaching. Not just read someone and says, oh, I think that's what it means, and then we take that and we make that law. We need to know what these writers were talking about. It's very important for each and every one of us. Paul was not teaching it as a sin to have a kitchen in your building where you worship. Look at verses 20 through 22. Let's read that together. Therefore, look at this. Therefore, when you meet together, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses in which you eat and drink? Do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this, I will not praise you. Think about this. Today we have our all-in-one right over here in the fellowship hall. We're going to meet together after the worship is over. We're going to go next door, and we're going to have and partake of a wonderful meal that we do every month, which is a wonderful thing. I know all you love it, and I do too. Now let's say many of the meals, and I will use a few examples. I'm going to use Connie's dessert and Connie's salad. I'm going to use Cindy's chicken and dumplings, and I'm not going to go further than that. I can't name all the wonderful meals, but let's say only a certain family. So let's say the Gentrys and the Foxes and the Smiths and the Haws and let's say and the Dietrichs. We could go on and on, but let's say that group only gets to eat the food. Why the others have to go and basically wait for the crumbs. Or they can't have the rest of any of the other meals that are made. Think of that and how bad that is. Think of the division of that. You have overindulgence going on. You have favoritism taking place. You have disunity of the body. And then there are brethren who are left out that go home hungry. Would that be a good thing? No, of course not. And that is basically what they were doing here in the first century at the church at Corinth. The Lord's Supper was being completely distorted. Look at verse 21. For in your eating, each one takes his own supper. What? He takes his own supper first. And this says, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What were they doing here? They were turning the time to come together to share and fellowship. And we call it a meal. We call it a feast when we partake of the bread and the fruit of the vine. The observance of the Lord's Supper. And they're turning it into a party. They're turning it into a gluttonous, drunken revelries. That's what they were doing. When you go study this, that's what you will come to know. It was a love feast. That's what it was. And that's why or how they were distorting the Lord's Supper. Basically, what they're doing is very similar to what they did when they were in idolatry and the pagans. Jude 12 talks about this. Also, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 13 talks about this. It was a ritual. That's what they were doing. Paul didn't instruct them to do that. Jesus, back in Matthew 26, did not instruct them to do this. They were not taking the Lord's Supper seriously. They believed it was no big deal on what they were doing. But they called it the Lord's Supper. And it was not. because God took no part in their ritual. He takes no part in our rituals if we follow rituals, which I don't believe we do. The wealthy believers brought a lot of food for themselves and they kept it for themselves. They did not share. They actually went into excess. Kind of like what I was talking about in my illustration, right? There would be excess of food for those families, and they would just overindulge, and they would say, "Sorry, I know you're hungry. Too bad for you. You're among the poor." They were well filled, but the poor of the brethren were not filled. Look at verse 22. Paul tells them if they want to have a feast, what does he say? You want to have this party, you want to have this dinner party, you could go and do that in your own homes. The time to do, basically, it's something that they do separate from the corporate worship, apart from the sacred feast. There's literally no respect for God and His church. The church was to come together in oneness, wasn't it? Oneness. So our brethren who are against having a kitchen in the building, that's not a sin in itself. That's fine. If you don't believe that, you don't want to do that, then go and not have that done. Go worship God the way you're supposed to worship God. But when you make it like it came from Jesus, a law from Jesus, and you accuse other brethren of walking in sin, there's a big problem. You're going to have to stand before God if you do that. And I say this with all love and all sincerity. If you're sitting here today and you do believe that, or you came from that, this is not to point any fingers at anybody. This is to make sure each and every one of us look into the scriptures and see what Paul really meant when he wrote this to the church at Corinth and what was actually going on. We have to look at, like I said again, we have to look at the context. The first century Christians did not come together to meet in a building, did they? What did they do? Where did they meet? Home. Did they have kitchens? They had kitchens. They prepared their food somewhere. They didn't go outside somewhere and do it and come back to their house. Think about that. They had homes. They met together in their homes. So they were worshiping in the homes. And Paul says when they came together and partied and the Lord's Supper was like, and they're doing the wrong thing and they're in disunity, that's the problem. I want them to explain this to me. Explain it. If I have it wrong, I'm looking at it and I read the scriptures, hear what Paul's saying, and then I know where they met, and I know they had kitchens. So it's the sin would be in the heart. The sin would be if they're worshiping the wrong way, right? The sin would be if they came together. If you're sitting here right now before we partake of the Lord's Supper, and even your heart somewhere else, even if you're going through the motions, we're going to look at that next week. We're going to look at 3 reasons, and I don't have time today to go through the 3 reasons today. I'm going to break it up in 2 parts. 3 reasons why we partake of the Lord's Supper. First of all, the first reason was it's stated every Lord's Day as we come together. We partake of the Lord's Supper in remembrance. That's what we're doing. Think about when Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples. At this time, he had not been glorified on the cross yet. They were still under the Old Testament. They still partook of the Passover feast, and he was sitting there with his disciples, and they partook of the Passover as he was teaching them. He's going to be teaching them what's to come, what's going to take place in this new covenant in his blood, like Matthew 26 states. We're going to read that right now together about the Lord's Supper. Let's read together Matthew 26 through 29. It says, while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after blessing it, he broke it and gave it to his disciples and said, take, eat, this is my body. And when he had given a cup and given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. For this is my blood of the new covenant. We're going to be looking at that next week, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. A Passover feast. That Passover feast was a sacred feast of the Jewish religious year. It was actually their most important celebration. It commemorated Israel's deliverance from slavery from Egypt, right? As we read in Exodus chapter 12. We see there that God had said through Moses, he said, go and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Him and Aaron went there to Pharaoh. He would not let his people go. So God brought about 10 plagues upon Egypt. And the callousness, the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, it had to get to all the way to the last plague, the 10th plague. That God was going to go through Egypt. And he was going to strike dead the firstborn of every house. And there was an exception there. The houses that had the blood of the sacrificed lamb, they were to sacrifice a lamb, right? The pure lamb, and to have unleavened bread with bitter herbs. And they were to remember that Passover. And so every house that had the blood that was over the top of the door into the doorposts, God would pass over. Imagine the sounds that came out of those houses that didn't have that blood. I'm sure there was screaming and crying. There must have been. The Passover, now we're into the Lord's Supper and the New Covenant. A day of remembrance, a day of gratitude, and that hope of God's redemption upon his people. Yes, Jesus basically stated, do this in remembrance of me, like we sang in the song. Wonderful songs that were sung, thank you, Wayne, on those songs. So when we gather around the table, so to speak, we're in memorial. It's a memorial, remembering Jesus, remembering what he did for us on that cross at Calvary. But is it just a sad day or a sad time when we think about him? It's a celebration. Yeah, I think about when a loved one, family member, a friend, or we go to a funeral. I hate to call it a funeral, but when we go there, what are we doing? We're remembering the wonderful life that person had while they lived in our life, and we're also having a celebration of their life. And that's what we're doing with Jesus. It's a little bit different that Jesus rose from the grave, right? And we're gonna talk about the body and the blood more next week, because I don't have time to go over it. I would like to have it all in one, but it's okay. You're just going to have to be back here. I'm looking at all the faces, and I expect you all back here next Sunday. Nobody could get sick. Nobody could travel. But yeah, we're going to stop there, and we're going to cover the rest in part 2. We're going to look at the emblems a little more, a little deeper. We're going to go into the Lord's Supper. We're going to look how it is a reflection. So it's a remembrance, number 1. Number 2, next week, we're going to look at reflection, and we're going to also look at how it is a renewal from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 23 through 27. And we're going to touch back on Matthew chapter 26. So the lesson is yours today. Think about that. Think about, I was going to ask the elders and do this and preach first and have the Lord's Supper after. We don't have to do that. We really don't. Next week, you're going to before I get up, we're going to be doing it again. And we're going to have our mind on Jesus. We're going to have our mind, because he is the most important one, right? He's the one. He has the ownership over the Lord's Supper. So we think about why we do it. We're going to come together and we're going to share. And we're going to think about that we don't do so divided. Our hearts shouldn't be divided. We shouldn't be divided as a congregation. It's wrong to do that. It's wrong to partake of the Lord's Supper in the wrong way because you could do it in the wrong way, as we just read. The Lord's Supper is our sacred feast, so to speak, and it's to give God the glory, the honor, and the praise. So if you need to come forward today for whatever reason it is, if you're ready to give your life to Jesus, it doesn't have to be now, but it's a good time right now. He always has his arms open for you, doesn't he? He's always saying, come, come unto me. If you need to come forward now. We'll pray together. If you need to be immersed in water for the remission of your sins, the blood of Christ has you. Just come forward with an open and a heart wanting to give your life to God. Come as we stand and we sing